by David. And the nice thing about this model is the calibration aspect of it. And I think, as Rick has pointed out with some of his studies, with a Griffith study recently, there are situations where these parameters matter, but over quite a broad range. The point, you try to design your model as accurately as possible, but if your model is wrong, it turns out that most of the errors go into this M. In other words, M, we call it the maximal bold signal change, but it's no longer the maximal bold signal change if your model is wrong. It's a different value, but at least, like here, if you're calibrating at 50%, you're forcing the model to go through that, as long as the other assumptions are intact, right? So that's a nice feature of the model. Now, there's lots of caveats. This is a steady state model, right? So if you're interested in any sort of phenomena on the time scale of the mean transit time, you can't do it with this. You have to go to something more advanced, like a balloon model, something which takes into account transit time phenomena. There's no separation of IV and EV, intravascular and extravascular effects. It requires hypercapnia, and it makes the assumption that vessels react similarly to during activation. So hypercapnia is almost always going to be one problem is hypercapnia is almost always going to be a long duration, right? If you're interested in using short duration, we just showed that if you accept that these contrast agents are properly reflecting the CVV response, then alpha is not 0.38 for a short stimulus. It's more like 0.15 or 0.2. It's much smaller, and it's not matched to hypercapnia. So there are alternatives, which are breath hold, hyperoxia, spin knuckle refocusing. All of these have disadvantages. Breath hold being obviously the closest to hypercapnia. Hyperoxia has some of the disadvantages that I just talked about, and it's not necessarily matching the flow and volume changes. Spin knuckle refocusing is incomplete, but in the end, maybe we want to give up on the hypercapnia anyway, is my feeling, except for sort of validation studies. This sort of model requires a well-mixed compartment. It's been mentioned before, obviously, you have draining veins, and it's not going to co-localize with the ASL, so you're not going to use this in these super high resolution studies, because now you're seeing distal effects, which are not reflected in the model. There are CVV issues everywhere. So to take a quote from the Griffith paper, one of Rick's paper, variation CVV distribution has the largest effect on the accuracy of the Davis model. In other words, flow is relatively well behaved. There are aspects of it that we don't, in terms of absolute quantities that we worry about, but in terms of percent quantities, it's pretty well behaved. The temporal response is pretty well understood. The CVV, the only thing which contributes to the model is not the total CVV, it's only the venous component of CVV. And are we looking at the venous component of CVV? Are we looking at the capillary component of CVV? Right? We have arterioles which are contributing more on a percentage basis than they are represented in the vascular themselves, and yet they're not reflected at all in the bold signal. So there's just sort of CVV issues everywhere here. How can we take a step to maybe make this to do more dynamic? Because it's kind of sort of disappointing if. So the very first Davis study, very first one that was done back in the 1990s, they knew of our CVV results. They said, in order to use this parameter, this Grubb parameter, the Grubb parameter was determined for hypercapnia, we have to stay away from transients, so we're going to ignore the first 15 or 20 seconds of our stimulus. We're just going to discount that, whether or not that was warranted, because at least the indications are that we should, but it's really disappointing if you can only use 30-second or 60-second block stimulus well separated. So can we do like much more rapid? So one possibility is that you just try to saturate this slow response. So this is data from a monkey. If you do this a block stimulus, you get this nice big slow increasing response, right? If you do rapidly modulated, unlike the bold signal would have a DC offset. Except in a finite impulse response analysis, the bold signal would also have this DC offset, but it's being reduced back to baseline by the undershoot, which goes in the opposite direction. The CVV, this post-stimulus tail, goes in the same direction, so you get this very pronounced stimulus offset, right? So you go down, but over this part, you're basically sampling the rapid component. right? You've saturated you've saturated the slow component. Now that has disadvantages. As Anders Dale showed many years ago for bold signal, the way to do event-related stimuli efficiently is not to do periodic stimuli, is to do randomized, to take the same interstimulus interval, randomize it, and then, because otherwise you filter out your response. And by randomizing it, you get that back, and in fact, you don't lose anything as you go to shorter interstimulus intervals. And the same exact thing is true with contrast agent, it's just more true. And it's more true because it's a slower response. So if it's a slower response, it's more important to not low pass filter this out. But one can imagine, giving up something. So here we go with randomized stimuli. It's much more complicated. One can imagine going to a periodic stimuli where you give it up, but remember, you're giving up a part which you're not actually detecting, right? I mean, in other words, in the bold response, it's a smaller part. So maybe just ignore a series about here, and it would be very interesting to see, for instance, if you can modulate the frequency of that, do sort of CMRO2 experiments, and indirectly see if you could see changes in the bold CBF ratio, which you could then attribute to CVV. That's sort of one way to approach this. And maybe one last question, because one last thing, because basically I'm done, right? So I don't know what to put here, so I just writing this up. So where do we go from now? I think, the problem is we understand bold signal embarrassingly well from a qualitative viewpoint. In other words, it's almost uninteresting, except if you really want to do things like get CMRO2 accurately. And if you want to make this fMRI routine, we have some problems. So we probably have to abandon hypercapnia. We probably need more complex stimulus designs. It'd be really nice to do bold and ASL almost routinely because, as Jonathan said, this orientation thing is a little bit of an eye-opener to me, right? Because I always thought this M obviously depends. You have to do that locally, right? It clearly depends upon the blood volume fraction. If you're not doing a hypercapnic calibration and you're trying to get CMRO2, it's not worth doing, right? But now it's just showing it also depends upon these other local parameters. And so it might be nice going down if somehow we could think about better ways to do this. And obviously, one of the focuses of the grant, which the work that Anna and Rick are doing is, can we get a killer app for quantitative fMRI? And how, is it like sort of, the inhibition excitation ratio? I mean, how are we going to use this CBF CMRO2 ratio? And in the end, we need to be open to non-fMRI methods, but that's easier said than done. Having worked in PET for a while, you can spend, it's interesting, but it's very different. But like Larry right now is working on MPI, and God bless him, but I don't know if it's ever going to beat fMRI. So, thanks.